Hi, and welcome to that JORVIK Viking Thing podcast. I'm your host, Miranda Schmiederer. In Viking times, a thing was a gathering, a place where leaders and warriors could meet and talk. In the 21st century, our thing is a virtual place where Viking academics and enthusiasts from around the world can come together to share knowledge. So hold on to your helmets as we learn more about Vikings on that JORVIK Viking Thing podcast. Today we have Lucas Norton on the podcast. He's one of the Viking interpreters from here at the JORVIK Viking Centre. He's with us today to talk about Viking myths and sagas. He's also hosting the daily saga for That JORVIK Viking Thing, which you can find on www.jorvikthing.com. Hi, Lucas. Thanks for being on the podcast today.
Hi there. It's a pleasure to be here.
So we'll start with the basics, Lucas. What is the difference between a myth and a saga?
Okay, so a general rule of thumb is that mythology is generally focused upon the pagan gods and goddesses of the Vikings, along with related supernatural things like elves and dwarves, whilst the sagas are much more focused upon the lives and stories of human beings. So our myths generally come from two sources called the Eddas. These were written in the 13th century in Iceland. One of these is the Poetic Edda. This has loads and loads of information about the myths in it. When you first read through it, it's a selection of poems which seems a bit random because all these poems, some of them are related to each other, but most of them are not. They vary in theme quite a lot as well. There's Hovamal, which is the advice of the god Odin, and there's Thrumskvida, which is a comedy in which Thor dresses in drag to get his hammer back from a thieving giant. This source is just a really small selection of some of the poems about the Vikings myths. It's a bit like a compilation album, really. It's like the greatest hits of the Vikings. It's a great source for understanding the basic fundamentals of Viking myths, things like the creation story, the end of the world, the characters of the gods. Mm-hmm. Our other source of myth is the Prose Edda. So we know who wrote this one. It was an Icelandic chieftain named Snorri Sturluson. And this one's quite different in that it's actually a medieval guidebook to how to write a poem. The author was a bit concerned that the Viking style of poetry, called skaldic poetry, seemed to be dying out. So in order to write those poems, you need to use these things called kennings, which are a bit like metaphor word riddles. And if you don't understand the old Viking mythology, these references just don't make any sense to you. It's a bit like if someone said, "You were the Juliet to my Romeo." That would make absolutely no sense if you didn't know that particular Shakespeare play, for instance.
Right.
Some of my favourite ones, we've got Moni's shirt. I looked up at Moni's shirt. Now, Moni is the personification of the moon, and the moon wears the sky like a shirt. So looking at Moni's shirt, I'm looking at the sky. But if you don't know Moni, what on earth is this man talking about? So this text is basically a crash course in the Viking myths and fills in lots of gaps in the other source. Now, the sagas, the word saga can mean either a history or a story. They're written down at a similar time to the Eddas. We're talking the 13th and 14th centuries. And unlike the Eddas, of which there are two, there are loads and loads and loads of sagas, way too many to list here. Mm-hmm. They can be huge novel-like stories, or they can be tiny. They can vary in size quite a lot. They cover lots of different genres. We have romances, we have comedies, some are more like chronicles. Their subject characters can vary quite wildly as well. The really famous sagas of Icelanders are generally about a bunch of farmers living out their ordinary lives in Iceland and the little soap operas of their daily lives. Others are about kings and queens. Some are about early saints and their weird and wacky miracles. But they're all set very firmly in the real world. For instance, York makes a few appearances in the sagas. Some are much more supernatural than others, and they blur with the mythology, which I've mentioned already. So we do have the god Odin, who makes sort of cameo appearances, and he'll do things like a riddle contest with a hero, something like that. But the sagas aren't really about the gods. It's a little bit like if Iron Man appears in a Spider-Man film. It's sort of like that.
Right.
They're firmly about the people, but we do get little clues and hints about the mythology.
That's excellent. So clearly, storytelling was a big thing for the Vikings. What's the cultural importance of storytelling for them then?
So storytelling would have been monumentally important to the Vikings because they were overwhelmingly a non-literate culture, by which I mean most of these people didn't read or write. They did have the runes, but runes are for scratching really short words and messages onto objects, usually bits of wood. So unlike in modern times, a Viking couldn't go to a library to get a book for fun, or they couldn't pick up a newspaper to learn what's going on in Jorvik these days. Storytelling is a way of transmitting knowledge through the generations and through the centuries. So a Viking could understand the world around them. So this could be the physical, geographical world. They could understand, where Jorvik fits into the grander scheme of the world. Or it could be an understanding of the cosmos, the supernatural, spiritual world. But along with that, there are also very, very basic fundamentals that stories can teach people. That's sort of the essential parts of a culture, like morality, honor, duty, love, those sorts of concepts. Practical information can be passed through storytelling as well. For example, in the poem Sigurdrivumal, there is a character, Sigurdriva, who goes through a really, really long list of supernatural themed advice on how and when to use certain runes. So ones that are for healing, for example. Now, this might sound really silly to us today, but you could imagine a really similar poem or story being used to teach people the practicalities of herbal medicine or something like that, quite practical skills. Storytelling passes on family history. We can see this in some of the sagas, which are written in the 13th century. They'll focus on characters in the late 10th, early 11th century, but the stories might begin with their great-great-grandparents living back in Norway long ago. All that information's been preserved through storytelling. They could share news through stories as well. We're very used to the idea that news is instantly available to us, but one could imagine, let's say a large battle occurs, there's a big change in leadership, one king dies, a new king takes over. So storytellers and poets could spread the news of the battle, the tragedy of the old king's death, the glory of the new king's victory. It's thanks to storytelling that we had these stories of the Vikings going to North America, for instance. Without that, there was no evidence of the Vikings going there until the 1950s.
Wow.
So it's a great way of preserving what on earth is going on in the world. And of course, we have to mention entertainments. We have endless sources of entertainment and media available. One could imagine a long winter's night in the north. Storytelling would be a godsend to stave off boredom and having a good laugh.
You mentioned that in the mythology and even in the sagas to a certain extent, there's a lot of talk about the Viking gods. And a lot of times we view Norse myths like we do Greek or Roman myths, that they're the basis for their religion. That's their understanding of the gods. Is that accurate, or did the Vikings have a different relationship with their mythology?
So to be honest, this is a really difficult question to answer. Now, the sources concerning mythology, they tell us lots of nice things about the Viking gods, like their names, their personalities. We've got the stories of creation and the end of the world. We get an overall shape of the universe as well, with the world tree Yggdrasil. Some of the myths give us ideas about behavior and morality, but then a lot of others just seem to be entertainment. The key thing that our sources don't really tell us at all, though, is how on earth did pagan Vikings practice their faiths and beliefs, and what was the spiritual relationship between humans and gods? We can get some glimpses here and there from written sources, and archaeology, of course, unearths objects and human burials with ritual characteristics. So, for example, we know that a temple once existed in Uppsala in Sweden. There's archaeological evidence of this, and a few medieval writers talk about it too. Rituals here seem to include sacrifices of animals and humans, which makes us think about the god Odin, who in mythology sacrifices himself to himself, and he regularly demands the sacrifice of specific people, such as in the saga of Gautrek, he manipulates a king into hanging himself. The writer Adam of Bremen also mentions sacrifices happening in groups of 9, and this number occurs over and over again in the mythology, so it's clearly of importance. He even mentions people being hanged, which again makes us think of Odin. We also find boat burials, big ones like the Oseberg ship in Norway, and much smaller ones like the Scar boat burials in Scotland. There's a writer called Ibn Fadlan who describes a funeral in which a man is burnt inside a ship. And all of these are very reminiscent of a piece of the mythology where the god Balder dies and is burnt in a ship. But on the other hand, we have countless examples of Viking Age burials which do not incorporate boats or ships at all. So this could be because of the cost of wasting a perfectly good boat, but it's clearly not a hard and fast rule that every single funeral must mimic this particular feature of the mythology. We know that the belief and use of magic seems to be very common. In the sagas, we have magical seeress characters, and we get clues about rituals they perform. The best example is a seeress named Thorbjorg in the saga of Eric the Red. So she has a really long, elaborate description of her outfits, which incorporates cat skin, which reminds us of the goddess Freya, who's associated with magic and cats for some reason. She eats a cooked heart from every species of animal in the area, which again makes us think of sacrifices. Then she climbs on a scaffold and summons some sort of mysterious spirits, whilst women form a circle and they sing summoning songs. And unfortunately, we don't have the lyrics of those songs. So women clearly have a link with magic and the supernatural. We have skeletal remains of Viking Age women as well, who have grave goods we associate with seeresses or maybe priestesses, things like staffs and narcotic drugs. But overall, we can't really see how on earth does this slot into the stories we have about the gods and goddesses. We have glimpses about other spirits as well from the sagas. There are animal spirit guardians known as Fulgia, and there are female spirits known as Disir, but they're not described in much detail. There's even a festival all about the Disir called Disirblot. This seems to be a private family event involving sacrifice, that we don't really know what people do during it, and how on earth does this fit into the wider context of Thor and Odin and Loki. The overall problem is we just don't have any sources which tell us how do you practice the worship of the gods? How, when, where do you pray? When and what do you sacrifice? I'd imagine that overall the practices of pagan rituals and each individual's understanding of their relationship with the gods was going to vary enormously across different times and places. We just don't have anything like a church hierarchy or a pope telling people this is the correct way to practice your faith. Essentially, there's loads of things about everyday life and belief from 1,000 years ago, which is lost to us. Some of it can be rediscovered through archaeology, of course, but we're always going to have some huge gaps in our understanding of the mythology and the relationship that people had with it. So I thought I'd just very quickly mention my favourite piece of lost mythology, which I really, really wish we could recover. There's a poem named Heimdallagaldr, which means the magic spells of the god Heimdall. Really cool name. The only lines which survive are, I am the son of 9 mothers. I am the son of 9 sisters. Now, what on earth does that mean? We could speculate that maybe Heimdall had 9 mums because he was reincarnated multiple times. Or maybe each mum carried him for 1 month of a 9-month pregnancy. Or maybe he was born in 9 separate pieces and assembled like a piece of IKEA furniture. But ultimately, we're just speculating. We just have no idea what the pagan Viking believed about Heimdall and his 9 mums. What was their relationship? We just don't know, unfortunately.
I suppose just like today, if something was so known and so obvious to people, it probably wasn't worth writing down. It probably
Exactly.
it wasn't worth taking that time, but I wish they had. So despite what we may think, Viking culture wasn't static. It changed a lot over time and in different places. Did the sagas or myths ever change over time as well?
So it seems quite likely that mythology and sagas would have changed over time. We've got to remember the Viking period was a very, very long period of time. In England, we date it as 793 to 1066, so that's several generations of people. They also travelled across a gigantic area, so they would encounter new people and new ideas wherever they went. Now, as I mentioned before, we're incredibly limited by the sources available to us. Our sources for mythology, the Eddas, both come from medieval Iceland. So these documents could just represent one snapshot of very late ideas about mythology, specifically from that part of the Viking world. But can we be certain that a Viking, let's say living in 8th century Sweden, would have believed the exact same stories that we have written from Iceland? Now, some literature gives us some clues about variations over time and place. For instance, in the Prose Edda, we have the story of the death of Balder. Now, in this story, the god Balder, who is Odin's son, he is accidentally slain by his brother Hother, who is tricked into throwing a spear of mistletoe at him. And mistletoe is the only thing which can kill him. Whereas we have an alternate version of this story written by a writer named Saxo Grammaticus in 13th century Denmark. And in this version, Balder and Hother are rivals fighting over a woman named Nanna. And interestingly, Nanna is Balder's wife in Snorri's version in the Prose Edda. Hother ends up slaying Balder, again using the only weapon in the world capable of killing him. Overall, the plot is largely the same, but all the relationships between the characters is completely different. And quite notably, Loki is completely absent from this second version from Denmark. So perhaps this could be a hint at all these kind of subtle variations in mythological traditions which exist in different times and places. In our surviving mythology, Odin is by far the most prominent god. He's the focus of loads of the poems, and he's a supporting character in many sagas. However, archaeologically, we find loads and loads of Thor's hammer amulets everywhere, and the word Thor appears in a huge number of men and women's names. So how does this fit together? Is Thor the main focus of the religion, or is Odin? We've got some big gaps missing here, but there could be a regional difference or perhaps a difference over time. We can pick apart the lines of certain poems and myths to identify changes over time too. For example, you might be familiar with the two goddesses Frigg and Freya. They're firmly separate characters, separate goddesses in most poems. However, this may not have always been the case. So Frigg is the wife of Odin, and Odin means the mad. Freya is married to someone named Odd, and Odd means mad. Now, Freya cries because Odd travels a lot. Odin also travels a lot as well, and their names basically mean the same thing. So perhaps Odin and Odd are the same character, and originally Freya and Frigg were the same character. Interestingly, Freya, that word actually means a noble lady. It's a title, like sir or madam. So maybe Freya was just another name for Frigg, but as time progressed in people's consciousness, they split into two separate beings. So we have these kind of subtle clues like that. There are also some gods which are basically absent from our surviving sources, but they clearly were very important to the Vikings at certain points in history. So one good example is the god Ullr, who most people haven't really heard of. He is the son of Sif, the stepson of Thor. He's associated with shields, hunting, and skiing. And he's barely mentioned in the sources, but in Scandinavia, there are loads and loads of places named after him. So this suggests that he was once really, really important, but perhaps by the time the sources were written down in Iceland, he was considered to be unimportant. Or maybe his name changed entirely. He could be in the stories and we can't find him.
Wow.
So ultimately, we just don't know precisely, but it's further evidence we don't really have a cohesive account of Viking mythology.
That's amazing. So kind of to throw another wrench in the mythology works, the introduction of Christianity had a huge impact on Viking culture, and the sagas and myths were probably no exception. How did Christianity influence or even outright change Viking myths and sagas?
So that's a really interesting question, because all of our surviving sagas and mythology, they're manuscripts written down by medieval Christians after the Viking period. So Christianity definitely had a very large impact upon the literature, but perhaps not in the way that most people would expect. So Christianity certainly had influence upon the style in which sagas are written. They often praise the virtues of Christian characters, and in sagas, they often end with the main character going on a seemingly random pilgrimage to Rome. For example, in the saga of Revar the Sly, religion is not mentioned at all until the last page. Sometimes female characters as well, they will become the holiest nun that Iceland has ever seen after all their adventures. The sagas of Icelanders specifically, those events take place around the time Iceland converted to Christianity in the year 1000. So often we see main characters like Kjartan in Laxdala saga. He will leave Iceland as a pagan, goes to Norway, converts to Christianity, and comes home. And the characters will think long and hard about whether they should accept this new religion, but ultimately they always accept it. And the conversions refer to as the best thing that's ever happened in the history of Iceland. We sometimes see conflicts between pagan customs and Christianity as well as major themes in stories. Like in Eric the Red saga, there's a really, really weird chapter where a plague of zombies appears, all because people were not being buried with correct Christian rites. Once they do that, the zombies go away. We get sagas all about spiritual and saintly Vikings as well. So, for example, in the saga of the Earls of Orkney, there's quite a large section devoted to the life and the miracles of Saint Magnus. Now, Saint Magnus is a really good Christian. He's such a good Christian, he refuses to fight on Viking raids. He just prays and sings songs instead. And after he dies, he miraculously blinds a bishop from beyond the grave, but later he restores his sight because he's a nice fella. Now, when it comes to the mythology, there's a bit of anxiety, I think, that some modern readers have. They might ask questions like, a Christian wrote this. I wonder if he changed the story or edited it, as if there's some sort of anti-pagan agenda. But we don't really find any evidence of this. We have to ask ourselves, why would somebody want to edit one of these stories? All the surviving mythology we have doesn't have any instructions on how to be a pagan, for instance. We're not told how to pray to Thor or sacrifice to Odin. These stories that we have, they're mostly entertaining soap opera about the gods' lives. And we have to remember that medieval Christians were happy to read stories about classical Greek and Roman gods, and there weren't any worries they might accidentally become pagans or anything like that. I think they were able to rationalize that my ancestors believed this, but they were wrong. The stories sure are fun, though. Linguistically, we're able to actually date a lot of the mythology firmly into the pre-Christian period as well. They've been preserved pretty well in the form of poems, which are quite difficult to be altered because you'd lose things like rhymes and alliteration and things like that. One key thing, though, to mention is that some Christian writers, like Snorri Sturluson, who wrote the Prose Edda, he probably presents the mythology to us in a way that makes it way too kind of cohesive and too systemic. So Christianity is a very rigid way of dealing with truth and dogma and orthodoxy. So, for instance, there's a very fine set of rules. You must believe this and you must do that to be a Catholic. If you don't do these things, well, you're not a Catholic then, are you? So I couldn't say, I'm a Christian and I think Jesus is God's uncle. That's just heresy, of course. Pagan beliefs are very fluid, very flexible. There's nothing like a Viking Bible that tells you this is the correct version of the mythology. Now, we could imagine Snorri Sturluson sat there with all these manuscripts on his desk, all these poems in his head, just struggling with these really countless messy and conflicting contradictions. So what he's done is he's tried to iron them all out and make them seem a lot more kind of canonical and easy than they probably really are. So he's not changing the mythology as such, he's just presenting it to us in a way that makes sense to him as a medieval Christian. And one interesting thing that's worth mentioning is the very start of the Prose Edda, Snorri introduces that God created the heavens and the earth, then he introduces the Viking gods. And it's really bizarre. He says that the Viking gods come from the city of Troy, from the Iliad. He says that Odin and Thor are Trojans who came from Turkey to go live in Scandinavia. And the name of the gods, the Aesir, that's basically the word Asia, where Troy is. But then after this, he doesn't mention this plot line again. It's just very much standard myths and legends, very faithful to the original sources. So he's writing in a way that lets him talk about the gods to his Christian audience without sounding like he's actually sympathizing with old pagan beliefs or anything like that.
Who would have known that the gods were actually from Troy? I'm going to have to write that one down. That's good to know.
It's a really common thing in this period. Lots and lots of different cultures and countries in Europe, they try to trace their ancestry back to the Trojans. We find that the English and the Welsh do this as well. It just seems to be a bit of a meme in the medieval period.
That's so fun. Well, for our last question then, Lucas, today it seems that the sagas in Norse mythology are as popular as ever. Why do you think that is? Is it just because the Vikings are popular at the moment, or are the sagas themselves just all of a sudden striking a chord with modern audiences?
So, yeah, the Vikings are hugely popular at the moment in popular culture with both adults and children. Over the past decade or so, we've had a tsunami of Viking-themed entertainment. We've had things like How to Train Your Dragon, Skyrim, Marvel's Thor, Assassin's Creed Valhalla. Now, some of these are, of course, more accurate and faithful to the truth than others are. But either way, I think all of these films and games, they've been great at providing people with kind of like a base level of knowledge, a base level of understanding, and an interest in the Viking period. And this often leads people to go and seek out the original sources of the information. So this could be going on a visit to the JORVIK Viking Centre, for instance, or this could mean checking out a book on sagas and mythology. Now, we're really lucky that the Viking sagas and their mythology are very widely accessible in easily understandable modern English translations, which makes them really, really accessible to modern readers. I think that a lot of other cultures, myths and legends, unfortunately, can be viewed as not so accessible. They can be quite difficult, quite alien, maybe viewed as only suited for academics to read and research. I think in general, literature from the ancient and medieval world can often feel quite alien and difficult to modern readers. But the Viking sagas, they are pretty unique as a genre. Despite being 1,000 years old, they're surprisingly readable and they're very understandable to modern readers. And I think the characters within them, they feel very relatable, very real, very grounded. We understand their hopes and dreams and adventures. So yeah, I think they do strike a chord with modern audiences, definitely.
That's kind of a theme that we're finding throughout a lot of these episodes, is that even though they were around over 1,000 years ago, the Vikings aren't too entirely different to us after all.
Yeah, definitely. At the end of the day, people are people, aren't they? We like the same things, we hate the same things. Yeah.
and all of our gods come from Troy. So
yes,
yeah.
Exactly. Yes.
Well, that's amazing. Thank you so much, Lucas.
You're welcome.
And remember, if you want more saga goodness in your life, Lucas is hosting 6 saga videos about Breath the Sly, which you can find on jorvikthing.com. Thank you for listening to That Jorvik Viking Thing podcast. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and anywhere you get your podcasts. If you'd like to support That Jorvik Viking Thing, visit jorvikthing.com to make a donation, as well as to find a whole horde of Viking-related content. Don't forget to hit subscribe so you don't miss the next episode of That Jorvik Viking Thing podcast. That Jorvik Viking Thing podcast is a production of the Jorvik Group and York Archaeological Trust. Researched by Miranda Schmiederer and Ashley Fisher. Produced by Ashley Fisher. Sound designed and edited by Miranda Schmiederer.